the delegate of Iraq to change. Are there any objections to this paragraph? Delegate of Saudi Arabia.
The delegate of Saudi Arabia would like to change the word launch attacks into assisted attacks because not all groups would be able to launch attacks, and that groups that are helping to supply drones and such would be in fact considered sort of like militant groups.
Could the delegate of Saudi Arabia please, could the delegate of Saudi Arabia suggest that instead of just deleting launch, say launch/assisted, and instead submit that change?
The delegate believes that an assisted launched would be kind of important.
Actually, the delegate, according to the definition of the delegate of Iraq, launched is completely based upon itself, while assisted is basically assisted by some other source of power. But in order to ensure that the definition is covering the entirety of the militant organizations, launch/assisted could include both the supported and the self-centered based off attacks. And would the delegate of Saudi Arabia please make that change instead of just striking out launch?
The delegate of Saudi Arabia in that case would withdraw the deletion of launch and include a slash in between launch and assisted.
That change has been noted. Delegate of Iran.
The delegate believes that assisted is very unclear and it could be treated with too much ambiguity, seeing as people who go to the site of a recent drone strike and get hit by drone missiles might be counted as assisting the terrorists, and therefore this category would be allowed.
The delegate does not understand why they actually go help save the terrorists that are injured.
Terrorists have family too.
To clarify the delegate of Iran's point, the delegate of Iran is saying that assistance could be very vague because it is not entirely sure, and there could be many more suspects of potential assistance of terrorist organizations. With still countries with a record of high suspicion ratings, for example, the United States, will potentially say how we have, for example, that how drone strikes have been launched because the people were assisting the terrorist organization, and because of that, the delegate of Iran is pointing out the fact that it might be ambiguous and it is somewhat vague.
The delegate of Syria would like to propose a change launch/assisted into participate. Thank you.
Oh.
That change is being made. Delegate of the United States.
This delegate would like to point out that in the continuous combat function tests, like adopted by the ICRC, there actually is something describing, like helping to reduce the ambiguity. Like in assisted, there's in this test there's something called like direct combat function, or like indirect combat function, and like the ones that are indirect cannot be targeted as militants. So this delegate believes that if that should be participated in with a direct combat role based off of the ICRC test.
The delegate believes that the clause proposes modifying the continuous combat function test, and therefore the modification would be to change it to participate.
The delegate has no idea what it just said because the delegate is modifying, not deleting everything that was already in there.
So the delegate is the change is to modify the definition of militant in the ICRC, continuous combat function of the ICRC to that the proposed thing in
what this clause does is it expands the definition. It doesn't change what's in there.
Yeah.
And in the definition, there already is something based off of direct combat roles and indirect combat roles.
I think that the delegate believes that the change is to expand it to include non-direct combat roles.
Right.
Can the delegate respond in note form?
Right, to clarify, what the United States is trying to get is that by changing this definition, it doesn't really change the actual original definition, because the original definition already includes what you wanted, what the delegate of Syria was saying. Is that correct, United States?
Yeah.
But the current ICRC only includes direct combat role.
Okay, I'll send you the link. Okay.
So, the delegate of the United States is saying how it is redundant to repeat the definition, while Syria says that the definition was not even inside. Correct?
No. Wait.
Okay.
The delegate of Iran would like to point out that if the delegate of the United States is correct that we should be expanding it, the delegate of Iran believes that the entire subclause is pretty much redundant if there already is a definition.
Under the circumstance that there's already a definition/qualification for what is militant and what is civilian, the delegate of Saudi Arabia would like to delete the whole subclause.
The delegate will explain what's going on. Okay. So, before we put in assisted, this expanded definition of militant to include people in organizations that launched terrorist attacks, right? Because before the definition didn't include that, so we were expanding it to include that. Okay, but then as a delegate very rightly pointed out, launched maybe wasn't the best term, so there was also assisted. Okay, and then the delegate of Iran stated that assisted was very ambiguous, and the delegate of the U.S. was just trying to point out that it's not really ambiguous, because if we look back at the original test already adopted by the ICRC, there is something talking about what assisted in really means, and at what level we can actually consider them to be militants. So the delegate was trying to say that assisted in isn't actually ambiguous, because there is already something covered in the original test.
So would the delegate of the United States like to retain the original wording of launch/assisted?
Yes.
Under the circumstance that there's already regulations, the delegate of Saudi Arabia believes that this subclause is henceforth useless and would like to delete the whole subclause.
The delegate of the U.S. would like the delegate of Saudi Arabia to please listen. So if we don't consider launched assisted in, we don't consider that at all. What this clause does is it expands the definition of militant to include people that are part of an organization that helped launch terrorist attacks. That's not something covered in the original text. So it's not useless. It does something. And the delegate believes this confusion is caused by the delegate of the USA stating that there's something talking about assisted in the definition. However, this was in the context of say civilians in an actual battle, among states. So the delegate is just trying to expand that to include non-state actors.
Okay. Thank you to the delegate of the USA for explaining that clearly to the delegate of Saudi Arabia. The delegate of Saudi Arabia would like to withdraw his charge.
As well as the delegate of Syria would like to withdraw his charge.
That is in order. So currently the clause now reads, expanding the definition of militant to include willing members of all organized armed forces, groups, or unit parts of a party which does not belong to a state that's launched/assisted in attacks on the defending state fitting the UN description of terrorist attacks. Are there any objections to the clause as written? Delegate of Iran.
This delegate would like to strike out willing and include willing members, seen as child soldiers or other people who are forced to do the work, might also count as terrorists or militants.
The change has been noted. Delegate of India.
Living out of this specific change for a while, India has some questions about what this clause actually does. But proposing the modifying of this continuous combat function, will the UN actually change it? And what does this continuous combat function actually do in practice? And so basically, what do all these clauses actually do? This is a question targeted at supporters of this clause and the submitter of this clause.
So if you look at the current test right now, there's a bunch of stuff about states, right? Okay, so yeah, like all members of state like own like organized, like armed forces, groups, or units, whatever. Okay, it's all states against states, right? Countries against countries, nations against nations. But that's like now terrorism is like a real thing, and ISIS isn't really a state, right? Actually, that's not a good example, I think. But anyways, terrorist organizations aren't always states, and so the definition of militant in the context of in terrorist organizations isn't really clear. So what this clause does is it makes it clear. If the delegate is really confused, he can ask questions in note 1.
Thank you.
So moving back to the delegate of Iran change to delete the word willing, are there any objections to that specific change? Seeing as there are none, the clause now reads, expanding the definition of militant to include members of all organized armed forces, groups, or units part of a party which does not belong to a state that is launched/assisted in attacks on a defending state fitting the UN description of terrorist attacks. Are there any objections to this paragraph as written? Seeing as there are none, we will now move on to subclause B, which states expanding the definition of militant to include willing members of all organized armed forces, groups, or units part of a party throughout its history of conflict against the defending state unless. Are there any objections to this paragraph as written? Seeing as there are none, subclause 1 reads, the conflict has been resolved. Are there any objections to this paragraph as written? Seeing as there are none, subclause 2 reads, the member has been deemed incapable of future participation in conflicts in ways such as not limited to prison or hospice care. Are there any objections to the clause as written? Seeing as there are none, we will now move into subclause B, which states expanding the definition